As we addressed, we're here to speak about child and adolescent to parent violence and abuse. What is it and how can we work on it? Okay, so that was our quiz. Thank you to those who participated. So, what is child and adolescent to parent violence and abuse? So let's start an overview of what CAPVA is. So we're going to be using the acronym CAPVA, and that will represent, obviously, the child and adolescent parent violence and abuse. So when we speak about CAPVA, we're referring to a form of domestic violence. Okay, it is any violent or abusive behavior that is exhibited by a child or adolescent upon their parents or caregivers or whoever's there looking after them, basically. And this possibly even transcends towards their siblings, so other members in the family. We have had cases where the violence is mostly directed to one person, usually it is the mother, but then there are also violent episodes that are upon a grandmother, for example, or as we mentioned, sort of a sibling. So other family members are also affected by this, and that is why we say it's a family issue. So it's about understanding what is happening in the family and why this dynamic is coming up. So as can be said for...
Hello, Doodlebug. I'm sort of on lunch, but I'm also...
Enjoy your lunch. So as we say, sort of for intimate partner violence, and how if you had to look at the cases across the board, we say that it does not discriminate. And this applies as well when we talk about CAPVA. So what I mean by does not discriminate is that cases can be found all around us, irrespective of one's economics, status, one's gender, sexuality, race, age, relationship type, as we mentioned. So these do affect all different types of families, be it single parent families, be it families that represent the nuclear model of a family. And as I said, as I already mentioned, sort of irrespective of one's economic status or way of life. Hold on, I'm just going to move this a bit. Okay, so yes, CAPVA, from what we see, is very much underreported, and there is a lack of a legal framework throughout and within different countries as well. So there's no specific legal definition for CAPVA. This can be said for Malta as well, where it's not specifically defined, but with the way our law is written up, CAPVA would be a subtype of domestic violence. So it is catered to, it is addressed in that way, however, not specifically directed, directly addressed, directly written in the law. And that obviously causes certain struggles for professionals who are working with such cases, or with the parents or the caregivers who, because of the lack of framework, the lack of definition, it often leads people, up to their own either professional, what's the word? Professional, up to their professional opinion as to where to take it, what to do, and likewise with the parents. They're a little bit more confused as to where to go, who to report to, who to seek support from. So yes, the legal framework or some sort of framework is very important. When we speak about triggers of CAPVA, there can be many. There can be many triggers, many contributing factors as to why this dynamic has been created within the family. And some of the reasons, or let's say the most common reasons, can be exposure to any form of violence, or exposure to specifically domestic violence within the household, from maybe a parent to another, or possibly another child within the household who's also showing these violent behaviors, which and then would lead to modeling of that same behavior. So as we know, kids are like sponges of all the experiences around them, or that they're observing, or that they're experiencing. They take that on, and then that is sort of projected into the world, into their environments. Another reason could be situations which the child has, and by child, I mean, I don't mean child as in age, I mean child by relationship type. Okay, so when I refer to child, I'm not referring necessarily to someone under the legal age, but more the type of relationship. So the child might have experienced situations that are deemed as traumatic for them, also known as, and in this case we are referring to age as well, adverse childhood experiences. Okay, and we know that these can set off several consequences that might also affect the child's behavior. Other than that, we have maybe the child experiencing loss or grief that will also tie to the traumatic event. Parenting styles might be a contributing factor. Now, the way we did the quiz, so those questions were mostly regarding myths or reality, and one of them in fact was parenting styles. Now, when we speak about CAPVA, when we speak about violence and abuse, we cannot put that blame on one specific aspect. So we cannot say that it's a parenting issue, that by sending parents off to a parenting course that will fix everything and then the child will be fine. However, we do see that maybe certain parenting styles can contribute to, again, the dynamic that's created within the family. So apart from, yes, so we mentioned the parenting styles, the way that the family communicates between them could also be a contributing factor. Whether they deal with emotions in the first place or not, whether they're able to verbalize those emotions and say, I'm angry, I'm frustrated, I'm upset over something that was said. And a lot of the times we see that these conversations are not actually happening within the family unit. So there's a huge lack of communication, and the way that the child does communicate, unfortunately, is through this outburst of emotion, outburst of anger. So we have that, and then we have as well possible issues pertaining to mental health or addictions or neurodiversities as well, which, as we mentioned, may contribute to this aspect of then power and control that comes out when we have cases of CAPVA. And generally speaking, unless these triggers, so the way we work is we try and explore what the underlying triggers are. And by understanding what the triggers are, then we're able to regulate ourselves more. We're able to regulate the situation more, handle the situation in a better, healthier way for the family. So unless, so generally speaking, violence worsens over time. So unless these issues, unless these certain patterns of behavior are addressed, and support is found for them, it can be very hard for the cycle to break. Then we move on to effects. So effects, as we can imagine, effects of violence within a household, of abuse within a household, come with it various consequences and stressors upon the family unit. And again, family unit being whoever the dynamic is. And parents and caregivers might often feel in denial of what is actually happening. It's not something that's easy to accept. It's not easy to accept that your child or the young person that you've been caring for is violent towards you. There might also be feelings of isolation or despair towards the situation. What do I do? How can I get out of this? How can we make the situation better? What can be done? I cannot control my child. How do I gain that control over my child? So that leaves a lot of feelings of helplessness with regards to a way forward. So here we go back to the lack of legal framework. What do I do? Where do I go? Should I report? Should I not report? So cases, obviously in your different parts, the legal age for the criminal liability age would be different, possibly different to ours. So ours here is 14. So there's a lot of, again, that helplessness comes out a lot with cases we have of that are younger than 14, because obviously there's not much in terms of legal framework that can be done. Feelings of fear or worry towards the child or other people within the household. Okay, so that's, again, that feeling of tension and fear in the household. That obviously brings with it a lot of stressors on the family unit. And there also might be feelings maybe pertaining to a sense of failure as a caregiver, or a bad parent. And this could also come from, I don't know, society views, or should I speak out? But what if I do speak out? They're going to comment on my parenting, they're going to blame me as a bad parent. Or even judgments by people that know the family, and certain comments like, come on, he's your child, how can you not have control over your child? And obviously certain opinions and then that come with it, that you should just put your foot down, discipline your child and get on with it, type of thing. But again, once we go back to the triggering factors and understanding the dynamic that is being created, it's really, really important to work with the whole family on it, in order to iron out these stressors. Okay, and all these feelings, all these underlying feelings that are happening within that family dynamic, obviously, as we said, puts a lot of stressors and tension within the household, but also within the couple relationship. And by that I mean, for example, if we have a nuclear household, we're talking about both parents that might not agree on a way forward, might not agree on the same way forward for their child, or if there's one biological parent and then this biological parent has a partner, for example, obviously that adds a little bit to the complexity of the dynamic. That would also need to be looked into and worked upon. And obviously worked upon in order to avoid other arguments or other possible constellations that may add to the tension. Okay, and then we have our way forward. So as we know, as adolescents move towards adulthood and aim for that independent life, it is common for them to challenge the boundaries with their caregivers, with their parents or with people of authority. However, the challenging does not, or still should not, include violence and abuse. So during this developmental phase, if violence and abuse is present in the dynamic and these behaviors are being exhibited, and these behaviors pertaining to power, pertaining to control, coercion, intimidation, and even threats onto other family members, then it's extremely important that support is sought out for all the family members. Okay, so this is the cycle, the anger cycle, the cycle of anger, however you want to refer to it. And this is the foundation, so to speak, of what we work with. So again, starting point would be the event, the person, or the situation which triggers someone's anger. So that's the point of trigger. Then following that, we see the negative thoughts which start coming up, the irrational negative thoughts which occur following the trigger. So let's say that, I don't know, we have a kid, a teen who's playing video games. I'm in the middle of my video game and my mom comes and tells me to switch it off. I'm in the middle of the game. I really don't want to switch it off. My friends are on, so that is going to start triggering me. I don't want to leave. I don't want to leave my game. I want to finish my game, but I'm being told repeatedly to switch it off. That's going to start triggering me. Negative thoughts. I'm misunderstood. No one's listening to me. I'm saying I just want to finish this game. My mother doesn't care. Okay, so there can be a buildup of these negative thoughts, from rational ones to irrational ones. Obviously all in a negative way. So following the negative thoughts, we then have the emotional response. And that's when the emotions which follow the trigger and the negative thoughts start coming up. But obviously the child might not, this usually tends to go from trigger to behavior response, or trigger to thoughts to behavior response. But when we break it down with our clients, when we start exploring and going in depth into that trigger, we find that there are all these other steps happening as well. Okay, so it's very important to work on understanding it. So we have the emotional response again. So following the thoughts of me feeling like my mother doesn't listen to me, isn't considerate of my needs or my wants in the moment, I might be feeling sad, I might be feeling hurt. But those are obviously all masked by the anger that comes out. So if you're familiar with the anger iceberg, or if you just Google the anger iceberg, that's a really clear picture of what we're talking about in terms of emotional response. So we have all the various emotions underneath, but the anger is what shows on top. Then we go into the physical responses, which is the way the body automatically responds to being angry. So we explore those as well in terms of what the warning signs are. How do I recognize that I'm about to explode, that I'm about to escalate? I need to pay attention to what comes before. And those are the physical responses. So when I start getting angry, I might notice that my heart is beating faster. My hands start feeling sweaty. I can't keep quiet. I need to pace. So these are the possible physical responses. And then we have the behavioral response, and that is the way in which an individual reacts based upon those thoughts, those emotions, those feelings, and those physical responses. That behavior response in that way comes out in the violent outburst.
Thank you, Ilongrid. I think that was a very, very good introduction and a look into what CAPVA is and some of the work that you do with the young persons. So I'm going to give you a snapshot of the way we work and the services that we have in place here in Malta. Within Agencia Poch, which is the agency that we work for, we have the domestic violence services. Now, in the domestic violence services, we have a number of services which are not directly linked to CPV service. However, we listed them here so that you can understand the array of services that we offered in our agency. So we have the domestic violence unit, which is the main unit, the main service which works directly with CPV. We have a risk assessors team who work with the police within the police depot, and they carry out risk assessments of victims when they report domestic violence. And we have an emergency shelter as well. So those are the victim services. But within our service, we also have the services which cater for the perpetrators, be it adults and also the younger ones, the adolescents and young adults. So the perpetrator support services include a social worker who carries out assessments, and when the men who come forward are seen to be eligible for a domestic abuse intervention program, they move on to the group program, which happens roughly twice a year here in Malta. We also have a support group for the men who finish the program and would like to continue receiving some more support, or would have stopped the service altogether, but at some point in their lives they feel they would like to reconnect, an assessment is done, and they might be eligible to continue receiving support from the support group. And we have a very small service of women who use force, which also falls under the perpetrator services. However, the most important service for this presentation is the child to parent violence service. So, whereas the domestic violence unit and the stop services for the older perpetrators perpetrating abuse in interpersonal violence have been around for a great number of years, from the late 90s. CAPVA is a relatively new service for us. It started in 2018. The framework was completely different from what we have now. Before, it was a number of professionals who used to receive referrals, meet up, consult, and discuss a way forward. However, there wasn't a specific professional working with the young people. Since 2021, we have Ilona on board in the service, who's a psychotherapist, and she works directly with the young people. Whereas the rest of the family is then supported by the domestic violence unit, the social workers who work with victims of domestic violence. So as you can see, the numbers have continued to increase since 2018 till now, and now we have seen quite a leap forward in the statistics, and we have already exceeded the numbers of last year, and we are not even now to the end, gotten to the end of the year. COVID has maybe highlighted more the need for this service and for a framework to support the families and identify a way forward of how to work with the families and with the young people perpetrating the abuse. And we have seen quite an increase, in fact, in 2021.
I'm really sorry to briefly interrupt. We're at 1:45. So we wanted to budget about 15 minutes for the Q&A. So I think we're going to go over a little bit. We are recording the event, so if people have to leave before we get to the Q&A, we will have the recording of that. But please just bear in mind that we have 14 minutes to 2. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. This year, given this sensitive issue, the sensitive form of domestic violence, which is still very much a taboo, and as Ilona was explaining before, a lot of the parents and caregivers find it hard to seek help. They find it hard because, as was explained, they feel judged, they feel helpless, they feel they are going to not be understood. They fear that if they speak out, they might criminalize their children. We felt that it was even more important to raise awareness on the problem and to expose the service that we have for families to feel more at ease to reach out for help. So apart from the main conference that we had on the 25th of November, we received thorough training throughout the week, last week, and we had an international, a foreign speaker give us training on a toolkit and how to work with cases of CAPVA Ilona wrote an article. You can see some photos from the conference, and we had a number of appearances on TV and also on radio stations. So as I started to explain before, and as Ilona was explaining in her presentation, CPV, the service of CPV cannot work on its own. And the DVU of social workers supporting the victims, we cannot work on their own. At some point, we have to come together because, as Ilona was saying, it is a family issue. The young people, the people perpetrating the abuse, need to be responsible for what, for the actions and the choices that they are taking. However, all the family needs to be supported throughout the process and even the way forward, how the family are going to then relate together. So the parents and the young persons are supported systemically through the different services within APPOACH. We also frequently hold case conferences and professionals meetings to constantly update each other and agree on the way forward that makes most sense and it is most effective in helping both the young adult, the young person, and the family and the rest of the family. So we're
going to the family ones. I don't know if we should jump a bit,
Yeah,
and then they'll have all their slides.
Yeah.
So basically, our thinking has now gone into looking at systemic approaches, and this is in line with what research is showing us. Also, because as we have rightly said, and you agreed that this is a family issue, and so we're introducing as well systemic interventions within our multidisciplinary team interventions. A few ideas of how systemic interventions can be helpful as well. So like when abuse is happening within a family context, the person suffering the violence obviously might minimize and accommodate, and so it's important to bring it into the forefront. There's also a relationship of love and abuse going on, and that's a contradiction in itself, which is often experienced in families. And as a practitioner, it's very important that we are cognizant of the different forms of violence that can be present in the family. Yes, sure. I'm Colette Svaruda-Bennett at the moment who's speaking. In addition to this, there is this dichotomy of abuser and abused, which may be blurred in some cases, especially because the actual role of the abuser might sometimes be the person who's the victim, and vice versa, especially when there are multiple complex problems in the family. Because obviously we understand that families themselves are complex, but then obviously violence and other power and control issues continue to increase that complexity. So as systemic therapists, we have seen an increase in terms of parents violence, adolescent parent violence. And for that reason, there was research also carried out by one of our leading family therapists and academics in Malta around this issue, who's also our supervisor. The parent violence is taking place within the wider context of family violence, and it might be mutually influencing the relationships rather than a linear or cause and effect reality. Okay, it's important that we believe that, yes, the young person will be held responsible for the abuse, but there's also, it's very important that we look at the mutual violence as a conflict resolution strategy, and that we engage in that conversation with the family. And that obviously this is a reality where if the young person is still a minor, then the parent is also legally responsible for that minor, despite the power dynamic that at present seems to be overturned. So there is still a responsibility and still legal powers that the parent holds, but in terms of what's happening in the home, in the relationship, the parents are no longer in that position of power, or at least of authority. Yes,
Yeah.
we can skip that.
Okay, we can skip. So as I mentioned before at the beginning, this is sort of another approach that is taken, a trauma-informed approach. So as I mentioned at the beginning, it's really delving into the trauma that the child has experienced and the effects of that trauma that, unless worked upon, can lead to exhibits of violent behavior. I'm not going to go into it because of time, but you have some slides here that's I think Anna will be sharing. Okay, so our Q&A.
Well, that was a quick turnaround on those last slides. Just for your information, I shared the evaluation link for our reporting in the chat. I will take the 1 minute to mention that. So if anybody has to leave at point 2, or if you're an hour earlier at point 1, please fill out that evaluation form before you leave. We gathered some questions during registration, and I think regarding the slides that you skipped at the end of the presentation now, I'm going to jump right in with the question of that was posed by Sharon. When we talk about child-to-parent violence, do we look at the child's violence as a result of the control and domestic violence that they've potentially suffered as a victim, and the wider impact of that?
So as I mentioned earlier, we would consider that as a possible contributing factor to the behaviors that are being exhibited by the child. So the mirroring of what they have seen, which can apply really and truly to any form. So, you know, if my mother says please and thank you, then it's automatic, you know, that I absorb that in, and then I project that onto my environment. So I want to say please and thank you. So likewise, if I am exposed to violent behavior, if that is the way that I have seen the people around me communicate, and that is the only way that I have seen people to be listened to, then it is very possible that can also be behaviors that are exhibited by the child. This is obviously not to say that there are obviously other dynamics where children have been exposed to violence and do not in turn use violence themselves. Okay, so it can work either way, but that is something we ask for in our assessment process. So it is something that we inquire about in order to see whether there has been exposure to violence or not.
Okay. Thank you very much for that answer. I just want to say that if anybody of our participants want to ask a question, please feel free to raise your hand, or even just unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can also share a question in the chat. We have Elena. Yes, please go ahead, ask a question.
Hi everyone, and thank you for your presentation. I have a question about responsibility. In perpetrators programs, of course, we focus on the fact that the violence is the responsibility of the person who enacted. How do you practice this kind of focus on your programs, or in this case, the approach it's a little bit different, or something like that?
Should I answer this as well?
Yeah.
Thank you for your question. So I would say that all-rounder, when working with perpetrators, the element of responsibility is very important. So starting off by understanding that these behaviors are not acceptable, and that violence should not be a form of communication. So that is quite similar with us in terms of this is the process we go through with our adult perpetrators, and it is the process we go through with our young ones. Okay, so the ones exhibiting the violent behavior. So as I said, the responsibility is very important. We do have that conversation with them that, listen, these behaviors are not okay, and we need to discuss why they are not okay, and we will go through that process with them. But obviously having the time to understand the triggers and understanding them as well, in terms of, okay, I know that must have been really frustrating for you that your mother told you to switch off your game and you were in the middle of the game. I can understand how frustrating that is, but how can we communicate that differently next time? How could you have had that discussion after, where as opposed to banging things, as opposed to swearing or name calling, which in reality won't change the situation. You know, you're still going to have to switch off your PlayStation or whatever, but how can we communicate that in a different way that just creates a space for more understanding? But then going back to acknowledging that the behavior is not acceptable.
Thank you very much for your question, Elena. Participants can reflect on whether they have any additional questions while I ask Tony's question, who shared it during registration. So they asked, what are some of the key indicators in young people's behaviors that they will have problematic adult relationships? And I imagine this is relationships more broadly, but maybe also intimate partnerships. So if you have any insights into that.
Well, again, I feel like a broken record, but I keep going back to the triggers and understanding the situation, understanding what feelings, what situations trigger the person, because these can be once again copied and mirrored into intimate partner relationships. In general, if violence and abuse becomes a way that one communicates, then
communicates effectively and getting the way they want from communicating that way, right? That's
exactly, yes. Then in whatever situation I'm going to be in with the people closest to me, that is going to be my turning point. So again, with our young ones, with our CAPVA clients, whose ages range between, so the service in itself sees clients between the ages of 13 and 25. And the peak of our clients are between 13 and 17. So not all have reached that age of being in a relationship, but once we see that there are either in between or starting to explore relationships, or 17-year-olds who are established in a relationship, then we do look into that dynamic as well by, again, exploring what's happening at home and seeing whether any of these behaviors are repeated, or any of these belief systems, for example, because the certain patriarchal belief systems might also be embedded in the child. So we explore whether those are also transcended into their intimate partner relationships. And I think one of the main focuses of working with CAPVA is trying to break the cycle before it reaches any other relationship.
Thank you very much. I don't feel like you're a broken record. I feel like I took something new from that.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. I would suggest that we wrap up the Q&A section with a question that might be interesting for some who are looking at setting up this type of service. What sort of specialization do the people working with children and adolescents have in your organization? Is there anything that you can share as good practice with our participants?
Take this one.
Yes, I think that what we found that has worked well is that we have a social worker who has experience with working with young people and children. And I think that level of understanding and experience helps, especially working with young people with, challenging behavior, for example, in other contexts as well. In our case, our social worker had experience with looked after children. And then we have a loner who was a psychotherapist, also had experience of working with young people. And that in itself has also been very helpful. And in January, we'll be having an addition to the team, and we'll be having a family therapist who's also a social worker as well, who's worked with families within the community, and obviously then worked within with children as well within those families, and is someone who's very much interested in working with young people as well. But her main aim would be to be working with the families in as a unit. Again, once the violence is no longer present, and there could be space for repair. So I think a general interest in working with young people is essential. Experience would also be very helpful if that's even possible. But I think it's important to have, committed individuals who are also very willing to continue to learn in the area of children and adolescents, especially around trauma, attachments, and the development of relationships, how young people experience these relationships as well.